All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us and welcome. I'm Katira Kapoor, and I have the privilege of being the Senior Director of Health Promotion, Wellness, and the Spark Your Health Talk series here at the 92nd Street Y. Thank you for being with us on this beautiful evening. This evening, Spark Your Health is joined by seasoned pediatric emergency physician, Dr. Christopher Strother from Mount Sinai, who will share expert advice to help keep your child safe, healthy, and ideally out of the emergency room this summer. That's what we're hoping for. Our format this evening will be a moderated discussion followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, so please feel free to be submitting your questions into the chat throughout the duration of the talk. And we hope you will join us for upcoming Spark Your Health events, such as the Future of Leadership is Neuro-Inclusive with Dr. Nancy Doyle in conversation with Mount Sinai Chief Psychologist Dr. Taifk, coming up this Wednesday, July 16th at 12 p.m. And at this time, I would like to also thank our Spark Your Health Talk series sponsor, Mount Sinai Health System, for their generous support. And I'm now pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, who's going to teach us so much. Dr. Christopher Strother is a pediatric emergency medicine physician at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. He is the former director of pediatric emergency medicine. He is an award-winning educator and a leader in the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, serving as the Director of Clinical Competency. He's known nationally as an educator in medical simulation, giving talks around the country on medical education, simulation, and pediatric emergency care. So I think there's no one better than you, Dr. Strother, to help us keep our kids out of the emergency room this summer.
Well, let's not say no one, but I'll give it a shot and do what I can to help.
Amazing. All right, so let's just jump right in. So summer is a time for outdoor adventures, pool days, family fun, but it's also the season when pediatric emergency rooms may see a spike in preventable injuries. So can you speak about some of the more common summertime injuries that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. Summertime is definitely injury season. The winter time is cough and cold and fever season. The summer is head injuries and broken arms. What we see the most because everybody's outside and running around and the sports pickup and the outdoor play, a lot of ankles, a lot of wrists, a lot of bonks on the head, so we do a lot more stitches and a lot less, fevers and flu. And you add to that a little bit of the summertime heat, right? Getting dehydrated, sunburn, those kind of things will sometimes show up if they get really bad.
Yeah. And what do you recommend for playground safety overall? You mentioned those bumps, bruises, broken limbs, any preventable plans that parents can make?
Yeah, I think playgrounds are an interesting question. For me, I'm definitely a let them climb on the things dad. I've got two boys at home, and try to let them get halfway up the tree before I try to sneak over and bring them down. But I think for a playground, it's a couple of things, right? Is just the general safety of the space, right? Is knowing is there any broken equipment? Are there any sharp things on the ground? Is there any rust on the side of that old swing set that's been sitting there for a long time, right? Kind of being aware of that stuff. Sometimes you'll see the metal slides and things that get super hot in the summer, right? So sort of keeping an eye out ahead of time, looking for those kinds of hazards, just things that are a little either not kept up very well, or the really hot spots, the black or the metallic things that can really heat up in the sun. So keeping an eye out for those things. I mean, you can't stop them from flipping off the swing or climbing down the ladder the wrong direction. But if you're mindful of the space when you get there, you can sort of point things out ahead of time to try to avoid.
Absolutely. And we actually have, as part of our camp planning process and our safety documents, we have this really wonderful sheet that talks about playground safety and sort of what, in an ideal world, and of course, what we teach our staff and counselors to do prior to the kids even going onto the playground equipment. So I think to your point, sort of doing an inspection, like, hey, kids, why don't you sit down, have a sip of water because you're going to be running around for a while, so get hydrated now, and we're going to do a quick check. Because you're right, there's not always caution tape, or there's not always that proactiveness from the town where the park is. So taking that upon ourselves to do that, I think, is a really good tip.
Absolutely. It only takes one person to drop a bottle and not clean it up, or, those sort of things you've always got to be mindful of. So just that quick sweep can go a long way.
Yes. I always think about the kids' hands getting really sweaty too, and then jumping to like the monkey bars or something like that. I don't know. As a parent myself, that always just makes me cringe that, like, aren't you just going to go slip sliding right off of that metal bar?
Yeah, I mean, the monkey bars have kept guys like me in business for 70 years or so. But, that kind of stuff, they're going to climb, they're going to jump, they're going to swing from the thing. So, just being careful with it. But, monkey bars are one of those. It's really more about just making sure you know what your kid's capable of and keeping them in the appropriate equipment. And, you can't stop them from deciding to climb up the side of the thing instead of the ladder all the time. But trying to steer them towards the equipment that's their size versus the bigger ones, that kind of stuff. But sometimes there's only so much you can do.
Right, right. Hard to swallow, but it's true. So let's shift to bikes because biking is a usually a big part of the summer. There's also a lot of like motorized sort of bikes and e-bikes and e-scooters nowadays. So anything you're seeing trending with that world, and maybe there's some just sort of basic common knowledge things we should be aware of as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the simplest things with bikes is just making sure that the kids know the rules, right? And sort of like, the plan ahead of time. Which side of the road are you going to ride on, right? When to stop, right? Making sure that bikes need to obey the stop signs and the red lights and those sort of things as well, right? They have to know which side of the street. Is there a bike lane? And if there is a bike lane, making sure that you're in it. And then, of course, New York City hazards like car doors, right? Is, being mindful of that kind of stuff and really coaching them ahead of time. So when they do go rolling down the street, they're watching out and they're following the rules, right? And then second is the helmets, right? And this is an obvious thing for a parent and a pediatrician to say, but I can't say it enough times, right? Is really having a helmet on in any bike, right? Big wheel, tricycle, scooter, motorized or not, right? You fall down and you put your arm out and break your wrist, okay, right? You'll see me and then you'll be home the next day. But like, you hit your head or you get your head on something and then down the street, that's when the more scary stuff happens. So, don't let them get away with it, right? They have to wear the helmet. They have to wear the helmet every single time. It is really, really key. The e-bikes as a parent are nerve-wracking because they go quicker and, because you're not pedaling, because you're not making the motion, sometimes it's easier to stop paying attention. Right.
Mhm.
So again, sort of being mindful of those things and some of the rules, right? Like, the level two bikes that are a little faster, 20, 25 miles an hour, they have to be in the bike lanes if there is one. They have to follow certain rules. You have to be 16 or 17 to ride one in New York City, I believe. So if you're 14-year-old wants one, the answer is no, right? And there's a reason for that. And then of course the really quick ones, that the professional folks and the folks really moving around a lot are on, have to be in good helmets, right? I mean, a lot of those folks should be wearing motorcycle helmets instead of like the little bike helmets because you're in traffic and you're dealing with that kind of speed. You've got to be really careful.
Absolutely. No, I mean, speaking of like the motorized, just vehicles in general or bikes, I think you bring up a good point about just making it a habit, almost like brushing your teeth, that like when you go to any sort of item that's on wheels, you put the helmet on. My daughter the other day, she has one of those like motorized Jeeps, which typically like she hasn't had a helmet on in the past for that. Maybe I shouldn't admit that, but it's typically pretty safe and slow. So my husband put in a new battery to the car and it flies now. And she was in that for about 20 seconds and we were like, get your helmet on. But so I think to your point, just sort of like evaluating, oh, maybe I didn't typically have my child wear a helmet for this particular, play thing, but maybe it is a good idea.
I think it's a great habit to start really early, even the slow ones, because they're used to putting it on. They just do, right? Like if it's what they do, it's right there. They do it every single time. Consistency is always the key with kids, right? Anything that's a rule, right? The more often you make an exception to the rule, the harder it is to get them to do it when you really want them to, right? So like really being consistent with that. And if they don't like the helmet, go get a cooler helmet, right? Like make it fun, right? Get one with the big spikes down the middle or pink and pink and green colors or whatever makes them happy. Find something to do that. My little guy had one that looked like a BMX helmet, and he just thought it was the coolest thing in the world when he was on his little scooter, and that's great. So, try to make it fun for him and be consistent. Yeah, you're 100% right. You don't think about it when they're little and slow, and then I always tell parents that the kids can always do a little bit more than you think they can do, and they can do it faster than you think they can do it.
Right.
And that goes from toddlers getting up into the kitchen to, the little kids on the bikes. So, get ahead of it a little bit. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, and I think about footwear also. I mean, I think probably the worst bike accident that I ever had as a child, I was not wearing appropriate footwear. It was probably a flip-flop,
Yep.
and the pedal got caught in between the sole of my foot and the top of the flip-flop and just flipped me right over. So, I'm sure you're seeing some of those accidents as well, where it's just not the appropriate footwear probably could have been avoidable.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't help, right? And you want to wear the flip flop to go to the pool, and you want to ride your bike. You don't want to take two pairs of shoes, but you're 100% right. The footwear makes a big difference. It's easy to get caught up, or when you try to stop, they slide, or you blow out your flip flop, so to speak, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like you're down, and then you're seeing me with an elbow, right? So yeah, footwear is another good key for the bikes. It's a great point.
Yeah. Um, so you mentioned pool. So, we have to go there. We have to talk
Yeah.
about pool safety, lake, ocean. If there are different tips that you have for each sort of body of water that somebody may find their family at, that would be great. Or maybe it's just general across the board, but would love to hear your thoughts on water safety and what you maybe have seen that could be concerning.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Is step one is the earlier you can teach your kids to swim, the better, right? Sign them up at the 92Y for swim class, right?
Exactly. Okay. Those sort of
But,
programs.
but in all honesty, like because even the little guys, if they can get just the basic little things, be comfortable in the water. If they accidentally tip into the pool when you're not looking and they're not scared, they'll turn around and grab the edge, right? If they've never done that before and they panic, and that's when the little guys really get in trouble. So I think the first thing is really early, getting them in the water, getting them comfortable with the water. Do those swim lessons when they're small because it can make a big difference. Even a 2 or 3 year old can pull themselves over the side if they're not afraid of it and they know what they're doing. And it doesn't take a whole lot, right? Just those little diaper dip introductory classes can make a big difference. So I think that's one. And then, the other ones, it's always about, for me, the first thing that comes up is just eyes on the water, right? At a pool, right? Most New York City pools, you're going to have a lifeguard, you're going to have somebody there keeping an eye on things, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, right? Keeping an eye on your own kids. The lifeguards are, a couple of 16-year-olds, God bless them. But if there's 30 kids in the pool, it can be hard to watch them all at once. So, being mindful of that. And, the scary stories, I live over the bridge in New Jersey now. And, so there's a lot of neighborhoods with the backyard pools. And the scary story you hear, the big barbecue party where all the people are there and nobody's looking, right?
Yep.
Nobody's in the pool that they don't know is there, and that's when the scary stuff happens. I can tell you, I'm going to have a big group together in a couple of weekends. We're going to hire a neighborhood kid as a lifeguard, right? Just to hang out by the pool.
Yeah.
He doesn't
Yep.
have to be a trained lifeguard. He just has to be paying attention to the water, right?
Hmm.
That's what you really need first. And it's the same thing, the larger the body of the water, the more that is important, right? Beach, if you go to the lake or you go into the ocean, right? It's the same idea. It's just making sure somebody has eyes on the kids, right?
Yes.
Because, they're either, you know, um, inexperienced, or if they're experienced, they get a little overconfident, right? And they got to go right down in there and they got to hit that wave in the ocean, and not look back. So I think one of the biggest things is eyes on the water is really important part of the safety, regardless of where you're at.
Yeah. And I have heard, I don't have these specifics off the top of my head, but I've heard that, especially for like lake and ocean, where it could be sort of darker water, to try not to dress your child in something like a navy blue or like try to get like the neon green or the neon pink. I'm not sure if you've heard any of that, but just like trying to make it, it's almost like the way people might dress a child if you're going into a big crowd like Disney World and you just want to, like, if you get separated, I know exactly what you're wearing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I see that in the chat too. It's a great question. I think bright colors are great for a couple different reasons, right? Is one is just visibility, right? Something that isn't the color of the water, like you said, is really helpful to be able to spot them out and pick them out. And also just if there's 30 people down there, which one's your kid? And yours is the one with the bright pink on. That's a little easier to track down and keep an eye on them. Both you mentioned sort of crowds. I think same thing, but both my kids are big fans of the neon shirts, and that's great for me, right? Because I can find them, and I love that. But I think for the water, it's the same thing. I think brighter colors. But the other thing that brighter colors do for you is they tend to be lighter colors, which means they're going to be less hot. Dark colors on a hot day on the beach, dark navy or black, some of those colors really they pull the heat in and you're going to get more hot, more tired. So we can switch over to heat and dehydration later, but
Yeah.
I think the light colors are good from that perspective as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, let's just go there. That was a perfect segue to talk a little bit about heat stroke, heat exhaustion, a lot of times camp counselors and like childcare facilities are taught these things, but it's interesting for parents who were just in the middle of it and in the thick of it. It might not be actually as top of mind for parents that are, having a beach day or at an amusement park. So, could you shed some light on what those symptoms look like and what could we do to prevent that from even happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the overheating that what you're looking for is sort of just the I'm too hot, need to sit down and rest, right? Going to sort of heat exhaustion, where is a little more serious disease, right? Where they're getting, you know, more tired than they should be just from being running around, right? Those guys get lethargic. And by lethargic, I mean it's like hard to get them up and moving, right? They're not just like, oh, I'm tired, it's been a long day. Like they can't get up and run around anymore, right? So that fatigue is the first thing that starts, right? And then keeping an eye on their skin, right? So kids will get a little sweaty when they're hot and running around. When they get too hot, they actually start to look dry. The body tries to start to hold the water in. At some point, your skin starts to look beet red and dry. You start to look more like a lobster. So getting too far down the sweaty path and it starts to dry up. So they get kind of this bright red, dry, tired, and then it's things like nausea, muscle cramps, right? Achiness. So if their legs hurt, their back hurts, their stomach hurts, they're nauseous, they don't want to drink anything because it doesn't, their stomach is upset. They've probably you're tipping past that line. The secret to all this is getting ahead of it, right? And keeping an eye on things. But, once you get to those signs, if the kids say they're tired, right? Let them stop, right? Find a cool place, find some shade, let them sit down and rest for a while. And always managing the fluids, right? I think for, a hydration perspective, and hydration makes a big difference. I think the thing that sometimes parents don't think about, some of the coaches and things do, if you're into like the sports world, you read about pre-hydrating, right? So it's not about just bringing the water bottle to the beach. It's about drinking a glass of water on the way there, right? Or even the morning of, right? With breakfast, drink a big old bottle of water before we even leave the house. And it makes a tremendous difference, is getting ahead of yourself. Because if you don't drink anything in the morning, you start a little bit dry. And then you get out there, it's hard to keep up, right? You're losing, it's hot, you're sweaty, you're running around, you're losing more than you can put in. And there's just no way to break that cycle very easily. So I think one of the most important things you can do is get ahead of it and just make sure everybody drinks their water before you leave the house. Everybody drinks some on the way. Don't just bring it with you and wait till they're thirsty. Get them started ahead of time. And that can really, really make a difference. 'Cause, once you get there, it's really tough. The way to get out of it is just to pull them out of the whole thing, right? Put them in the shade, put them somewhere cool, sit down, stop running around, start drinking the water as best you can. But if you get that far, you're kind of done, right? Your day is going to be close to over. You can't bounce back too quickly from that. It does take some time. So trying to get ahead of it is really important.
Yeah, and thank you. That's a great answer. And what about the folks out there that think, there may be people that think, well, we just need to do the opposite, right? We need to do like an ice, not ice, but maybe like a really cold shower. So what are some other tactics or things that people may like we can myth bust a little bit? What are things that you would say don't do this?
Yeah, well, I think it depends, right? So, like, I mean, if you really get all the way into, like, well, so heat stroke, right? So, heat stroke is the worst end of this when there's, really damage happening from being so hot. And you end up in the emergency department. We dump a bunch of cold stuff on you, right? Because we try to bring that temperature down reasonably quickly. I think in most situations, right, where you're not ending up in the emergency department, right, where they're just overly hot, they're overly tired, they look dry, they're whiny, they're nauseous. You can overdo it by dumping a big bucket of ice on them, right? And then they've got the chills, and then they're just more miserable. The easiest ways to do it is just one is removing the source, right? It's getting out of the sun or getting into the air conditioning. And two is just, putting some water on somebody can actually be really helpful, right? It helps you evaporate a little bit, right? You sort of replace the sweat. So when you get too hot, you stop sweating. So putting some of that back on your skin, right? A spray bottle with water is what you need. You don't need an ice bucket. You definitely don't want to jump them into a bucket of ice. You can actually sort of swing them into cramps and things and chills. So I think, slowly, if they're sitting there talking to you, complaining about how bad they feel, they're probably okay, right? And you can do it slowly. It's just get them cold, get them wet, take off the extra layers if they have them, get them sipping on some water. You don't have to be too aggressive.
And what do you tend to see in the emergency room when it comes to heat related sickness? Do you see more folks that you're like, you really didn't need to come in and there were things that you probably could have done at home? Or do you see it on the other side where it was maybe got really bad and you wish that somebody would have understood the signs earlier?
I think for heat related stuff, more the opposite. Because what happens is, or the second one is when people get really bad, they end up there. It's a combination of things. It's things like runners and folks that are really trying to push themselves and they're either underhydrated, it's a hot day, or they're not taking the breaks they need to take, right? Another big one we see in the summer is parades, right? The folks that are outside for the big parade in the summer, and they're either in the parade, so they're walking a couple of miles in the heat, probably not drinking enough, maybe eating a bunch of junk food, not properly fed, or standing on the sides doing the same thing, right? When you stand up, you get tired as well, right? And your blood doesn't flow around as well, and you get hot, and they get dehydrated, and people will faint and come in, and and those folks that are just standing in the parade too long and pass out, they're usually okay, right? Because it's not an extreme situation, is because those folks get themselves inside because they fall down and come through. But I think most folks, when they get pretty hot and tired, are pretty good about going and sitting down and going and getting in the shade and drinking some water. What I tend to see in the emergency department are the folks that are trying to do something else, so they push themselves a little too far.
Right. So now, if you have a child who you think is kind of going into heat exhaustion, you've removed the source, like you said, maybe got the spray bottle, you've done all the right things. What should a parent be looking for to be like, okay, I feel comfortable that I don't need to go to the ER? Because I'd imagine after a child has gone through heat exhaustion, they may still be tired, they may still be achy, maybe they're still a little flushed. So I'm guessing that piece might be a little confusing to a parent of like, okay, how long am I expecting them to feel this fatigue?
Yeah, I think kids in particular, they tend to bounce reasonably quickly, right? If I've been inside for I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes or so. And it's in a cooler environment and I've sipped some water and I'm in the shade and they're still really not looking well, you know your kid, right? There's my kid is tired because he's had a rough day, and then my kid is sick. Like, the parents will say, this is not my child, or this is not what my 4-year-old looks like. You've got to give it 15 or 20 minutes because they do okay. Obviously, they're incredibly uncomfortable. They're hard to wake up. They're really disoriented. Somebody faints, right? Those things you should just come on in, right? The ones that's a little more obvious. I think if it's more just I'm a little achy, I'm a little nauseous, I'm a little tired, get them out of the environment. Give them 15 to 20 minutes because it's generally not immediately dangerous, unless they're really off the scale, like these marathon runners and folks. Most people even when they come into the ER, by the time they get into the ambulance, they come over to us, they lay down inside. By the time I've seen them 15 minutes later, they start to look a little better. They're like, oh, I just needed to lay down. So you should pretty quickly start to see that corner. So if you've been at it for 30 minutes or so and they just don't look any better, if you're looking at them like, should I go? You probably should, I think in general, like if you're debating whether to, come into the emergency department or not, I'm usually going to tell you yes, and if you come in and I don't do a whole lot, great, right? I'd much rather that happen than, sit at home and have the people get worse. But, I think most part with the heat related stuff, if you get them out of the environment, kids in particular tend to recover pretty quickly. So I think that's the thing you're looking for.
Okay. No, thank you. That's really helpful for our audience. So I want to talk about, since we're talking about heat exhaustion, I thought we would shift into skin protection and sunscreen and, if you have any recommendations, SPF wise, frequency wise, maybe any emergency room related things you've seen for skin being overheated and overseen by.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna caveat with there's a lot of debate around sunscreen,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of mixed science around it. And so I'm just start with like the next couple of minutes are mostly my own opinion, right? And they're educated opinions, but there's still there's not you'll get different answers from a lot of different people.
Mhm.
But I think to start with, I think for sunscreen, I think the most important thing is being mindful of just using some, right? I don't think it has to be this insane SPF 3 million kind of stuff, right? And in fact, I'll bust a myth just to start with. SPF 60 is not twice as good as SPF 30, right? It's maybe 2% better. Right? It is not an equal scale. So, like an SPF measurement is this very unscientific, very unreliable thing that companies do to try to see how much UV light's being blocked. And the numbers that go up, the difference between 20 and 30 is not the same as 30 and 60 and 100. So like buying the giant SPF is not necessarily doing yourself that much more good. And in fact, there's some arguments not to go with the super high SPFs because one, it makes you a little overconfident. And maybe you'll stay out longer and in more sun than you might have otherwise, right? And then you get burnt. In the more stuff is in there, and there are more kind of chemicals and other stuff are in there too, right? So get yourself some good 20 or 30 SPF, basic stuff without all the additives, and you'll be fine, right? So I think that's the first thing is you don't have to go to like the 60, 100 SPF insanity, right? It's 30 is just as good and probably less likely to bug your skin, and a little easier to manage, and it has a little less chemicals in it, which always makes me happy.
Yeah.
So I think I would start there. And then the other big mistake folks make with with sunscreen is not reapplying, when they need to, right? So, one of the things is, start before you go outside, right? Put
Mhm.
it on when you're leaving the house, not after you're on the beach, right? Give it some chance to sit on there and be there. And then, if you're in the water for a while and you come back out, put a little more back on, right? If you've been there for a couple hours, put a little more back on, right? Like you don't have to be crazy about it, but that reapplication, if you put it on right when you get to the beach, you've probably already been outside for half an hour and you're going to be a little pink already. And if you don't put it on after you've been swimming, it's essentially not there anymore, right? So that's another one.
Do you have any concerns about the spray? Um, I just wonder, like, sometimes when I see the spray sunscreens, I think like, oh, is that getting into the lungs in some way or the environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed question because
Yeah,
the spray is incredibly convenient, and
it is.
for folks like me with a little hair on the arms, it's really pretty nice. Um, so I won't say I don't have it, right? But I think being mindful of it, right? It is easier to breathe it in, right? Which is not great for you. It is easier to get it in your eyes, right? I see folks all the time just kind of like go like this, and then I don't know if that's a great idea, right? If that's all you've got, put it on your hand and spread it. If you're going to put it on your face that way, don't spritz it right up your nose. And all that stuff with the propellants and the other things that make those things work, that's not great for the world necessarily. So yeah, I think it's something that pumps a little better, and some of the aerosols are better than they used to be about not having all the propellant chemicals and things in them that are so bad for the world. But so yeah, I mean, I think there's a convenience factor there, but there's probably better options, or at least being mindful about how you use it is probably a good idea.
Yeah. And is it fair to say that our friends out there should be putting on their sunscreen even on a cloudy day?
That's a great question. Yes, yes.
I think my worst sunscreen, my worst sunburn was on a cloudy day.
Yeah,
Kid.
well, you get overconfidence, right? Like you're like, oh, I don't need it. There's some clouds out there. I'm good. Yeah, no, 100%. If you're going to be outside for a long time, sunscreen is a good idea regardless. Because even if you're not getting burnt that day, right, it's good for long-term health.
Yeah.
Because what gets the skin cancer and things later on, it's long-term damage. It's damage over and over and over again over time. It's not that one bad sunburn you got on the beach the day because you fell asleep and weren't paying attention, right? So I think that preventative little bit of stuff, even on a cloudy day, is going to help you long term. And again, it doesn't take much. Grab the SPF 10 or 15 or the little lotion that's got some in it, right? There's a lot of great face lotions that have a little bit of an SPF to it. It doesn't take much. But yeah, absolutely putting some on there is useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the themes I'm picking up on tonight is just making those habits, like creating these little habits so like your child knows about the water safety because they've been in the water with you or in a lesson before. And yeah, to your point, they just know when they're walking out the door, or before they walk out the door to put on that sunscreen. Yeah, and the helmet, just getting that
Yeah,
helmet in.
same
So
idea, right? Make it a habit, make it a routine, make it fun. Find a way to make a game out of it. If it's consistency, right? It's a lot, and a lot of parenting, right? And this is not what you're here to talk to me about, but a lot of it is about consistency, right?
yeah.
Just set that expectation. You do it every time. It's no big deal, right? But yeah, I think that preventative bit, and I did want to toss out there the other thing when you're talking about the propellants and all that stuff for the sunscreens is just folks with sensitive skin. You know it sounds a little counterintuitive, but they call them mineral based sunscreens, which are like the zinc oxides. It's the white stuff. Right. If you've got young kids at home, you're used to Desitin, right? Like the diaper paste that's white. It's like finger paint that you put on.
So thick. Yeah.
That's the best, right? It's the same concept for skincare. It's a physical barrier instead of a
Mhm.
chemical barrier, right? The lotions that you rub in for sunscreen, they're chemicals. They absorb the UV rays. And if you've got sensitive skin, some of those chemicals are gonna mess with you, are gonna cause you to break out, are gonna be irritants.
Yeah.
So if you find yourself, the regular lotion stuff is really bugging you, go look for, like they call mineral-based sunscreens that have the zinc oxide, or there's a couple other different versions of them, but they have less of that chemical stuff and tend to be a little easier on the sensitive skin folks.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, since we're talking about outdoors a lot, I thought we'd go into nature for our adventure
Right?
seekers out
A little
there.
more outdoors, absolutely.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about, I mean, it could be for anyone who's going on a camping trip or out hiking. But what do you tend to see in the ER when it comes to like, plants, poison ivy, mosquitoes, ticks, things like that?
Well, that's a good list. Let's start with bugs and ticks. I think one of the common things, folks aren't sure what to do with, they come home with a tick bite, or they were out in the woods and then they're sick and they're not like, oh my gosh, what did I get bit by something? Like, is this related? Do I need to go get tested for Lyme disease and all these kind of things that really like, put this scare in people. So I think from one thing to really think about with insects is before, if you're really going for a legit out in the woods hike, right? Get yourself some bug repellent, right? And there's all kinds of different bug repellents. I'm a big fan of the like mineral based, like more natural ones that that don't have some of the chemical stuff, and we can come back to that later if you want. But again, kind of like the sunscreen, it doesn't take much, right? A little bit of prevention goes a long way. What is an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure, right? It's the old phrase.
Yeah, yeah.
Holds true in every bit we've been talking about today. There's a little bit of insect spray. If you're going really, really, really like long hikes out in the woods, wear long pants. With socks, so much more likely that you're going to pick up ticks on the brush underneath more than they're going to like fall on your head. You're going to get them from the long grass and stuff that you're walking through. So if you really want to prevent those things, like long pants, long sleeves, depending on the weather, you got to manage a little bit, right? But that kind of stuff can keep them off of you. If you do find a tick, removing them sooner is better than later. And there's a million ways to do it. Physically, there's lots. Everybody has their trick with the tweezers or the fingers or the credit card or the match or the Vaseline or whatever. But really, it's just about slow and steady. The trick is you don't want to break them. And I'm sorry if this is a little bit graphic, but their head is under the skin, right? If you just pull quick and hard, you could leave that head behind.
Mhm.
It's going to be an irritant. It's going to be a nidus for infection. And so really just being careful, getting a decent grip as close to the skin as you can, and moving slowly when you bring the tick out is the best way to do it. From a Lyme perspective, generally, if you find the tick the same day, you don't have a problem. Lyme disease almost never transfers in the first 24 or 48 hours. Most
Okay.
people who pick up Lyme have had a bug on them for 2 or 3 days even. That first little bit, the insect doesn't do a whole lot. And so, the secret here is doing the body check when you get home, right?
Mhm.
As long as when you get home, all the clothes are off, check the hair, check the armpits, check the legs, right? Do that big once over after you've been through. And if you pick them up early, you generally don't have to worry too much about it. It's the ones that have been on there longer that cause the problem.
Got it.
I know other thoughts on ticks before I move past it to other stuff.
I think so. You're just saying if you have been doing the full body scans on a regular basis and you notice a tick, oh, I did not have this tick here yesterday. Clearly, I had checked in the shower. Then there's really, even if it's like a 3-year-old, you don't necessarily need to go to the emergency room for something like that.
Correct.
But if you're not sure or it's possibly been longer, would that be an ER visit or would that be like calling your GP instead?
So yeah, I think you're better off talking to your pediatrician. I think the two things that would bring you in to see a doctor sort of sooner than later, right? Like meaning like if I can't get to see my pediatrician, and a pediatrician can absolutely send you for Lyme testing and start antibiotics and things like that if we need it. Is you're looking for sort of a rash associated with the bite or sickness associated with the bite. So, right, the two rashes you'll see is a cellulitis, which is just like a regular old skin infection, same thing you would get from a mosquito bite or a scratch, where the area around the bite is red and angry and painful and tender and hot, right? All those signs of infection. That's a reason to go get an antibiotic. The Lyme rash is a little different. It looks like they call it a target rash. It's this little round circle that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger out from the spot. If you're seeing that kind of a rash, a little largening circle, a target around where you were bitten, that can be a sign of early Lyme disease. That's a reason to go see somebody, right? Get tested and get started on some antibiotics. Because if you get the antibiotics sooner than later, you can prevent the disease. So if you just found the tick, you took it off, looks fine, no rash, no sick, you feel fine, you really don't have to go running in to see anybody. If you're fairly convinced it's been there for a couple of days, you may want to call your pediatrician and talk to them about it. But for the most part, they're not going to do anything at that point as long as you're doing okay. You just want to keep an eye out for some of those other signs of illness and then bring it to somebody's attention.
Okay, perfect. All right, I think we're good with ticks. You're
Oh, yeah.
welcome to move on to plants if you'd like, or animal bites. I don't know if like animal encounters is something that you see more in the summertime with squirrels and
We
I don't
can go
know,
to the
things
squirrel.
that children should not be petting.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, let's stay in the woods for a second, and then please remind me to come back to squirrels because
Yeah.
the squirrels are kind of funny. Is The plants in the woods, right? So that you're worried about poison ivy and poison oak and some of those things. Again, I think there's two things to know there. Is one is just keeping an eye out for where you are, right? Staying on the paths. If you're going through the thicker stuff, it's going to be around. You can look up what it looks like and try to stay away from it. But more often than not, I think people end up in it and they don't even know it was there. And I think the thing to know there is if you do start to get a rash, right? And then the poison ivy rash is kind of that like bumpy, oily, sometimes it gets a little blistery, super itchy, kind of a breakout. Was when you get home is wash it with something like dish soap to wash off the oils. So what the plants do is they leave an oil on you. And what doesn't work for an oil is like a super moisturizing, gentle Dove soap is going to spread oil around, right?
Mhm.
And so like think about if you get like if we go back, if we were changing the tire on your bike and you get that grease on you, right? What do you wash your hands with when they get greasy? The dish soap, right? It gets that grease off better than the gentle sort of moisturizing stuff you might have in the shower. So if you think you did pick up something or you're having that local reaction after being out in the woods, is go and grab your dish soap. My poor neighbor got poison ivy on his legs and then went in and used like a moisturizing soap and just spread it all over. Like the
Oh,
poor guy was like top to bottom poison ivy. It was just a total mess. And so I learned that lesson from him. Is go and get the anti-grease soap, not the gentle moisturizing stuff for that.
that's a great tip. I hope everybody writes that down.
Yeah, and I think if for animal bites, I think the thing people worry about, of course, is things like rabies, right? And I think there's the rabies really depends on the animal, right? In the wild, right, things like raccoons and bats and those things are the animals that tend to carry rabies. Squirrels don't carry rabies.
Interesting.
Full stop. So like we get a lot. We get not, well, I shouldn't say a lot. We get not infrequently somebody gets bit by a squirrel in the park because they're feeding it, runs up and it like decides that they're the nut and tries to run, and they panic because it's a wild animal that just bit me. Is rodents with the really small rodents, mice and squirrels and chipmunks and things. They don't carry the disease, and part of it is if they get it they tend to, well, it sounds bad, they die quickly.
Mhm.
But they don't tend to get it. It's the bigger animals, it's the raccoons and things you have to worry about more. But there's this very famous, if you Google it, I think it was in one of the Brooklyn parks. There was this crazy squirrel that had bit like four or five or six or seven people over a course of time, and it like made the news, right? It was this like an insane squirrel that was chewing on everybody in Brooklyn, but
Oh, gosh.
it caused a whole panic, and so
But
we
it wasn't rabid.
it was
It was
not rabid.
just
It
a
was not
personality
rabid.
quirk.
Nobody got rabies. It was just a personality. It was just a very angry squirrel for some
Yeah.
reason. But when it happened, a whole bunch of us started looking it up because we knew somebody was going to show up, and it's really not a thing. So the little guys, you can be pretty reassured. Just get it cleaned, right? Because they're still dirty. Get some soap on it and get it clean. But those you don't need to necessarily run into the ER for.
Okay, but bats do.
Bats do, yes.
Because I've had an alarming number of people that have had encounters with bats over the past 2 years, and they have gone to the ER.
Yeah, and bites by bats, or they even say because sometimes bats are hard to tell because they're so little. Is folks that you hear about people wake up with a bat in their bedroom,
Mhm.
right? And though you really probably should go get checked out, right? Because they can they can be aggressive, and you don't always notice it because they're so little. So yeah, bats are one we don't like bats. That's one to worry about. Squirrels are not.
Got it. Okay. This is more of maybe a year-round question, but just to sidetrack to domestic animal bites for a minute. Anything that a parent should look out for if a child is bit by a cat or a dog? I mean, of course, there can be a bite that just looks really bad and it's very obvious, but I know there can be bites that don't maybe look too rough superficially, but I know that things can go south pretty quickly with some bites, and I'm just wondering if you could explain how that works.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple things to look for there. So, cat and dog bites, particularly cats, because they're like punctures, they're more like needles, is they can push germs down underneath the skin, and they tend to get infected at a pretty high rate. So cat bites, particularly in the hand, in the face, or places that like infections are a little more high risk. They cause you more problems. We give antibiotics for those pretty early. So if you really get a pretty legitimate cat bite, or in dogs less so, but they still can be, a pretty significant bite from a cat or a dog probably deserves some antibiotics for a couple of days just to prevent it from getting infected. It needs a good clean out. You don't necessarily have to come to the ER for that if you've got access to your pediatrician. You can give them a call and talk to them about it. I mean, obviously, if they need stitches or something, it's a different story. But they are pretty high risk for getting infected. They're lower risk for things like sort of back to the rabies side of things. Even if it's not your dog, most dogs in the States are either vaccinated, or if they're owned dogs, right, they live in somebody's apartment, they're very unlikely to be exposed to rabies, right? They'd have to get bit by a raccoon, for example, right? And so, random dog walking down the street takes a nip at you, you're probably fine, right? Now, if you come into me in the ER and you say, I don't know who this dog was, the dog was really aggressive and didn't seem normal, I'm going to treat you for rabies to be sure, right? Because that's a scary thing. But if it's like your neighbor's dog and you were messing with it before it bit you, and you can talk to your neighbor later and make sure the dog's okay, maybe you need some antibiotics if it's a big bite. You probably don't need rabies treatment. The ones to worry about are the dogs that seem overly aggressive. We call them unprovoked bites, right? So if the dog comes to you to bite you, right, versus you stepped on its tail or something, and I don't know that dog, and I can't find out if it's healthy or not, it's worth a visit to the doctor. Your neighbor's dog that it seems okay because you accidentally pulled on its ear or something, pretty low risk.
Okay. And if one sees like a line starting to develop from the bite,
Yep.
it
Yep.
would be an ER. I just want everybody out there to know what happens if you do not go to get antibiotics, because unfortunately,
Sound like a story you've been around before?
oh yeah, my own mother just, procrastinates about things and had a cat bite, and sure enough, there was a line going up her arm, and when she got to the ER, they freaked out a little bit. They said, came at the last second that we could have helped you.
That sounds maybe a little melodramatic with
Yeah.
our doctors, but no, it's true. Yeah, a line spreading up the arm is sometimes a sign of a deeper infection,
Mhm.
which is why they're concerned. But yeah, anything spreading out from a bite like that, right? So again, sort of like the bug bites, right? The signs of an infection, redness, swelling, and pain, and heat, right? So hot, red, and painful means it's starting to get infected, and that should, the sooner you get an antibiotic, the better, because, to the ER doctor's points, the longer you wait, it can spread deeper and go farther. And then if it gets out in the bloodstream, now you're really sick, right? And in an elderly patient or someone who's immune compromised or a really young kid who doesn't have the most robust system, that can go really fast. So absolutely. So keeping an eye on those signs, pus and redness and the line going up. But what you see first oftentimes is just a spreading circle around it in the area. You shouldn't be getting more and more red over time.
Okay.
And actually, that's a good thing to put out there is the difference between an allergic reaction and an infection. We see this a lot with bug bites. As I get mosquito bit me yesterday, and now my side of my face is all puffed up. Is it allergic or is it an infection? And the way we tend to sort it out is, most people, if they're sort of allergic to bug bites, if they have these like local reactions to bug bites, they know it. But in kids, sometimes they may not have done it before. And usually the difference is if it swells up right away, right? An hour later, it's poofed up really big and it's itchy and you can touch it. It doesn't really hurt. It's probably allergic. Skin infections tend to be sort of slowly getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So if it's red and swollen the next day, it's more likely to be an infection. If it's red and swollen 5 minutes later, it's probably more of an allergic reaction. And the difference is, with an infection, you need an antibiotic. An allergic reaction, little calamine lotion, a little hydrocortisone, put some ice on it, take a Benadryl, those sort of things. You don't necessarily have to come and see a doctor for. But if that redness is spreading over time, right, or particularly if it's pretty painful, that can be
Yeah.
a sign of infection. You want to go talk to somebody, get an antibiotic.
Okay. Noted. Well, I'm going to shift to a few audience questions because wow, we could have done a 2 hour. This is a great conversation. So I think we have someone in the audience who may be sending a child to a sleepaway camp or an overnight trip. So just wondering from a health and safety perspective, if there's anything you could recommend that they are maybe asking the counselors or preparing their child for.
Yeah, I think for a camp, a lot of it is understanding what the camp can and can't do for different conditions, right? So is knowing your own child. So like somebody who's asthmatic or has pretty bad seasonal allergies. Those kind of things, you're going to be out in the middle of the woods or out in the heat can bring that kind of stuff out more, right? Your eczema can get worse, your asthma can get worse, right? If they've got digestive or stomach problems, and they're going to be eating camp food that's a little different than what they're used to, right? So sort of anticipating the problems that could come up with known medical diseases that your child has is one of the first things that you can do, and having that conversation with the camp early, right? If my child has an asthma exacerbation, where do they go for medicine? Who do they ask for? Who keeps the albuterol and who doesn't? Who's allowed to give it and who doesn't, right? The camps have different rules around this, right? Same thing like at your school, right? Some of the things the school nurse can do, some of the things the school nurse can't do, right? So I think understanding that ahead of time so you can tell your kid, this is the person you ask for when you need your medicine. If your stomach starts to be upset, this is who you talk to if you think you need to take your medicine. So I think that's one thing that's important. And then just thinking about, talk to that camp about, the stuff we've been talking about, sunscreen, right? Insect repellent, hydration, right? How and when do they make sure the kids get water, right? And talking to them about those things ahead of time. A lot of them have this on their website or they have it in their materials. They give you like a parent information where they talk about this, but asking them about those things. How do you make sure the kids get sunscreen on every day? And if the answer is the kids have to do it themselves, right? Then making sure that your child understands that And you talk through it. Okay, when you get up in the morning, what are you going to do? I'm going to put on my sunscreen, right? Like you're going to ask them that 3 times in a row, and they're going to be, Dad, stop asking me that question. But you're going to put it on, right? Yeah, I'm going to put it on. That kind of stuff I think can be really helpful because not all, some of them are better than others about that kind of stuff. And a lot of them, especially as the kids get older, they depend on the kids to be independent. And that's kind of the whole point, right? Is for them to learn to be independent and make those decisions and do those things. But getting a little bit of coaching and ahead of time and helping your child understand the protocol and not just yourself can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just even talking through some of these possible symptoms with a child prior to them going so they are aware. I mean, because a counselor can look and do the best that they can. But, let's be honest, if kids are running around in a field, they're all in the sun, they're all going to have flushed cheeks, right? But so the counselor may not be able to identify heat exhaustion as it's creeping up on a child, but sort of walking them through, if you start feeling a little nauseous, if you're really, really thirsty, all of the things that you mentioned, like you said, to your point, being independent and saying, I think I need to go put myself in the shade now.
Yeah, I think to an age appropriate degree, right? Like some of the younger ones won't be able to manage all that or think about it, or you'll scare them. And to be to be honest, most of the camps these days, especially the sleepaway camps, they're pretty good at this stuff, right? A lot of them they've been doing it for a long time, especially things like heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Like the counselors that probably get hit over the head with that stuff a good bit in their training. But I think the your point in a more general sense is letting your child, empowering your kid to say, I don't feel well. I need to stop doing this thing and go talk to somebody. I think is the way to do it because you can't anticipate all the different situations, right? It would be hard to do.
Yeah.
I think letting them know, like, hey, if you don't feel good, if something hurts, if you find a bug on you and you don't like it, right? Make sure you stop what you're doing and go let somebody know. You don't have to finish the hike. You don't have to finish the swim that day. If you don't feel up to something, be empowered, right? Be mindful of yourself. And if you start to feel badly, something hurts, something doesn't feel right, make sure you go let your counselor know. I think that's probably the best thing you can do for them is just give them that power to say, you know what, I don't feel good right now. I want to go talk to somebody. And that way, regardless of the situation is, they can step in and get them to the right people to help them.
Got it. All right. Well, we'll wrap up with two quick ones for you. So what do you recommend putting in a first aid kit for parents?
Oh, first aid kit for parents. So it depends on where you're going and what you're doing. But I think, in general, right? What you would think of would be in the one you bought at the drugstore, right? So Band-Aids, gauze. I've become a big fan of like antiseptic wipes, right? As a way to sort of clean up your hands or clean off a tool or something along that line. The hand sanitizer is great too, but I've become a big fan of having some of those antiseptic wipes around. Clean off a scrape real quick. Can be really handy. So those are nice to have around. And then a little bit of like gauze and tape if you get a bigger scrape is helpful. It never hurts to have a little antibiotic ointment in there. And then and depending on what you're doing, if you're out in the woods and going for a hike, I'll pull the Boy Scout out of me is put a whistle in there, or have a whistle in your backpack. If you get lost in the woods, the best thing to do is stand still and make noise. So things like that, like an emergency whistle, could be really helpful if you're going to be out and about, like kind of going back to the woods. If you're just packing up the car, I think, the basic bandages, antibiotic ointments, wipes, hand cleaners, things like that, are what you're going to use the most by far.
Yeah. Well, and this question you might have actually already answered it with that answer, but any specifics that you recommend for cuts, scrapes, yeah, what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think getting the dirt out of it earlier than later, right? So the surgeons say that solution is or dilution is the solution to pollution, but it watered out, rinse it out, right? Getting the dirt out of there and cleaning it and rinsing first. And you don't have to be fancy about it. It doesn't take a ton of peroxide or goodness, like, alcohol tends to actually make it a little bit worse. Like people like to put rubbing alcohol on stuff, and one, it stings. And two, it kind of damages the tissue more. So it's not actually great for you. Hydrogen peroxide's nice for cleaning up like dirt and stuff off of things, but it's really not necessary. Warm water and basic soap is really what you need for those things more than anything, because you're just trying to get the dust and dirt and germs off the top of it. And then most of the time, I think, keeping it covered when you're out and about, right? So a bandage to keep the abrasion from getting more dirt in it later on. But actually, in the house, things will go away quicker if you let them dry up a little bit. So I actually like, if I'm in the house and it's clean and I'm just watching TV, let that bandage be off and let it dry up a little. The cuts and scrapes will go away a little faster if they get dry. If you keep them wet under a bunch of antibiotic ointment and bandage all the time, it actually takes longer to go away.
Okay.
So there's a balance of putting a little ointment on it a couple times a day to prevent infections, great, but you don't need to keep it like soaking full of bacitracin all day every day. So let it dry when it's clean. Keep it clean and covered when you're out and about, and it might get dirty.
All right. Well, we are unfortunately getting out of time. Any number one overall last tip for our audience for possibly keeping them out of the ER this summer?
Number one overall, I'm going to go back to bike helmets. Let's make that the first one. But again, I think we said it a couple times, is that ounce of prevention. Taking a look at the playground and look at, anticipating things ahead of time. Hydrate before you go out. Sunscreen before you go out, right? Check out the playground right when you get there and figure out where the hazards are, so you can talk to your kid about it before they go down that super hot slide or off that monkey bars that they're a little too short for. Those kind of things. I think that's the best way, is that little bit of prevention and consistency will go a long way to preventing a lot of these accidents that can happen.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Strother, thank you so much for your time. I think we will have to have you back in the future for round two, because this was just so informative. And I feel like, yeah, we got to a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot more. But thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening, and everyone who's going to take advantage of the recording after the fact. We hope that you'll join us for upcoming Spark Your Health talks. And I hope that everyone has a great night and stays well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great to be here, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
Absolutely. And have a great summer, a safe summer.
You too. Have a safe summer, and hopefully I will see you in the park, not in the ER.
Exactly. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Stay well.